Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the soundbites. Ben Kinsley is here, who's co-host and sponsor of our show. Ben, welcome.
Thank you, Pat.
You want to give a little PR?
Sure. Yeah, I have a consulting firm called Imperium Advisors. We do a whole bunch of different stuff, everything from government relations to public policy development, strategic communications, mostly for nonprofits, but yeah, cover a whole bunch of ground.
And you can be reached at?
You can go to our website, imperiumvt.com.
Good, if you could spell it.
Yes, yeah, we'll get it up here.
Yes, exactly. Oh, I'm going to redo that whole
Yes.
thing. So we got. And our special guest tonight is Terje Anderson, who's the chair of the Vermont Democratic Party. Terje, welcome.
Thank you for being here.
Ben's got it.
Yeah.
That's good. I'm very excited about this because I think these questions are just getting all charged up here.
Absolutely.
So could you talk a little bit about yourself for the audience?
Sure. I live in Montgomery, up next to Jay Peak, in a ancient one-room schoolhouse that got converted.
Oh, you're kidding.
I
Those are
love being
cool.
up there.
Oh,
You know,
those are
just
cool.
wander through my yard,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. It's a great place. I moved back to Vermont about 10 years ago. I'd lived here before. I have some family roots here, but I'd gone off to work in Washington, D.C. for a while. I'd been politically involved here in the 1980s and 90s. I'd worked on a number of campaigns. I was Democratic National Committee man for about 10 years.
Nice.
Then I ended up in Washington, D.C. When I decided to retire, I moved back in 2007 and got back involved in politics just a few years ago and accidentally ended up being elected chair of the state Democratic Party about 2 years ago.
It's funny how you keep volunteering for things and eventually you'll get voluntold.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, how did I end up
I was
here?
drafted.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it
Now, you were
happens.
deputy for, was that what I read? You were in the party, but...
Well, I'd been national committee man,
Oh, okay.
and I'd been vice chair many
okay.
years ago, back in the late 90s,
Good.
before I'd left the
Well,
state
you
the
certainly
first time.
came with a great resume.
thank
I'm
you.
sure they're thrilled to have you. I just want to, before we get into talking about the Democratic Party and stuff, I noticed on your bio that you were the former executive director of the National Association of People with AIDS, and you also served on the Presidential Advisory Council. That is huge. And I don't know whether I'm right or wrong, but I just don't. After I read that, I said, we don't hear anything about AIDS as we did. I'm old, so as we did back when it was first being identified, and a lot of people were afraid and that sort of stuff. So could you tell us where you are on prevention, testing, treatment?
Sure.
And because it seems, am I wrong, it seems to be less of an issue?
Well, it doesn't receive the public attention that it
Yeah.
used to. We've made some incredible scientific advances. There are
Right,
treatments
exactly.
now
Right.
that basically means if somebody is tested and find out that they're
Yeah.
infected, they can live pretty much a normal lifespan,
So it's not
be
the death
very
sentence
healthy.
it was years ago. Right,
Exactly.
right.
I mean, I remember I was one of the people who started Vermont Care. Some of you may have heard
Oh,
of that
yes, right.
organization. And then I ran the state health department AIDS program for a number of years.
Nice.
And it was just such a different world back then. The progress we've made is really, both in the United States and around the world, is really powerful and important. But what we've also seen happening is, despite these scientific advances, they're not available to everybody. And so we still have a major epidemic going on in this country, but it looks different than the one did back in the 80s. It's an epidemic that's in the Deep South. It's largely African American,
Interesting.
gay and bisexual men.
Yeah.
And there's so much stigma, so much hidden going on down there. And there aren't good services in place. Many of these
Is
are
it
the
mostly because of cost, or just
a
the
lot of it's
services are
that.
not-
The services aren't there.
Huh.
It can be a little bit of a difficult environment to do the work in because of some of the more social conservatism that's
Yeah,
there.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
also because these are states that, for example, didn't expand Medicaid when that happened, and so access becomes a much bigger
Right.
issue.
Access to preventative measures
Yeah.
and
Yeah,
treatments.
and so we know if you get people in and they see the doctor and they've got coverage to get the drugs in them, they do incredibly well, but there's still a struggle.
Because I know way back when, it was very much focused on one group of people. And I think now we've all learned it can happen
Right.
to any of us, and you don't hear the comments and the the stigma that goes along with the LGBTQ.
Yep.
And I think that's good, that people know it's
absolutely.
not just this one group of people, it can be
Yeah.
anybody.
And one of the things to remember, right now, there are more people living with HIV and AIDS in this country than there have ever been. There's probably about 1.3, 1.4 million people.
Wow.
A lot of that's because of our success in getting people treated, but it's also because we still have too many new infections. And the same thing around the world. We've, through PEPFAR, which is a program that President Bush started and has been continued by everyone since then.
Yeah.
We've gotten millions of people around the world treated. I've done a lot of work in Africa and
Nice.
Southeast Asia over the years, and the progress is great, but there's still this huge
Right,
gap. And I
right.
think that's the challenge now in dealing with the epidemic, is closing those gaps wherever they exist.
So it's not as visible as it once
Right.
was.
No, you
but
don't
it's
see the
still-
headlines. You
right.
don't see the news stories all the time. We did back when Rock Hudson was diagnosed,
Oh,
all
right,
that sort of
yes.
stuff, and it was kind of sensational. And it's become normalized right now.
Right.
But it is still huge.
Yeah, yeah, and I know that it's interesting because you know, it brought a lot of awareness to it. Back in the '80s was cities like San Francisco that dove in and tackled it, and they had, and in a lot of ways it was you know, celebrities or you know, those types of folks that were driving the narrative,
Yep.
and I think that's changed a little bit. In the
Yeah,
last
you don't
30
see the
years.
red ribbons at the Academy Award anymore. You don't
Right,
see
right.
that sort of thing.
Do you
Yeah.
think that, I think it's good, isn't it? I mean, people, because I think people are willing to listen about it, about the disease and what to do about it to prevent it.
Yeah, we're definitely in a much better place
Yeah,
than we've ever
right.
been with it, but there's still a lot of work to be done.
Right, interesting. Well, thank you. I just saw that and I went, I just haven't heard anything. What's happening? But, all right.
All right, so diving into the
Questions.
questions.
Politics.
Yeah, exactly.
Questions.
So can you describe the focus of the Democratic Party today in Vermont? Like, what is the main driving force?
Well, I think what we try to do is advance a set of issues by electing candidates and participating in public discussion of the issues. We're not a ideologically uniform party. We're a pretty big tent, and we have people range from, you know, traditional, more moderate, blue dog, if you want to call them that, to very, very, you know, further left folks. We try to make room for everybody in that, to operate with consensus as much as possible, but to stand by certain principles about protecting the social safety net, about protecting our environment, about overcoming inequality, about ensuring civil rights. And I think whether you define those as liberal or you define them as progressive, those are the kind of core values that we hold together. We try to elect candidates who are going to support them. We try to advance those issues here in Montpelier in the legislature. But we have a lot of room for difference of opinion within the
Yeah.
party, and we're proud of that diversity.
It's, you know, it's interesting, you know, having been an observer of the legislature for a number of years, it really is noticeable how broad of a tent it is. You have folks that have been in the legislature for 20 plus years, and you know, by today's standards, maybe on the more conservative or moderate end of the spectrum, and then you have your traditional, maybe more liberal, you know, folks who are, you know, probably came in maybe 10 years ago, something like that.
Yep.
And then you've got the leading edge progressives who are also in the mix, and there's more and more of those folks that are either in the caucus or moving into leadership roles. And it's interesting to see how all of those people interact with each other.
Yeah, there's a lot of moving pieces, there's a
Yeah.
lot of negotiation, and a lot of nobody gets everything they want.
Right. Well, that's just the legislative process.
Exactly.
In general, nobody gets
Exactly.
everything they want.
So I think this leads right into that discussion because there's such an appeal of the Democratic Party in Vermont, but also what it fascinates me is young people. Why do you think that you've got that attraction for young people?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that produce that. I think one of the first ones is young people tend to be much more socially liberal, socially tolerant, and as the parties have moved in somewhat different directions on those sets of issues. You find young people who, were heavily supportive of gay marriage, who support, are more comfortable with racial diversity, those sort of issues. And I think they're finding a home in the Democratic Party because they don't see that reflected as much in the Republican Party. And I think that's one of the major reasons. I think one of the other ones is, quite frankly, climate change.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about that later, but that's huge.
That's
I mean,
huge.
kids-
And for young people looking at their future, thinking about what their children and grandchildren, let alone themselves, are going to experience, when you have, and not every Republican is a denier, but when, President Trump says, it's made up by China to hurt us kind of thing, when you see rolling back of so many environmental regulations to fight it, I think young people are really turned off by that, and they hear the Democratic Party being more willing to tackle issues like that.
Yeah.
And so I think those are two of the main reasons that we see young people gravitating more towards the Democratic
I
Party.
think for some of us, a couple of issues you brought up, because we are one of the older
Absolutely.
states. Just me, okay, me.
Me
I
too.
don't know what you're looking at me for.
I was brought up in a different generation from these with these kids, and it takes me a while to really, I try real hard to think about, put myself in their place, and it's not the easiest thing to do on some issues. And I just would appreciate, I hope they recognize that some of us are brought up in a different generation, and we're trying, because some of the times they're just right. Some of the times not, but some of the times they are.
Sometimes we are.
Sometimes
all
they
of us.
are.
Well,
Sometimes
I
not.
think one of the other things too that within the last several years that has really appealed to young people is progressives like Bernie and folks like that who are pushing economic policies that are really targeted more towards young people.
Absolutely.
So things like $15 minimum wage, paid family leave, those are policies that really hit directly at the working, 20, 30 somethings, right?
And I think it's really important to remember that there's a whole generation now that hasn't recovered from the Great Recession. The job opportunities for a lot of young people come out of college if they went to college with massive student debt.
Right, that kills
and
me,
they were
that.
promised that they would get great jobs, but unless they're in certain tech fields or whatever, the jobs aren't there as
Right.
much.
Yeah.
Their chances of owning a home, being able to negotiate a place where they can have families, where they can build a life that's economically secure. That hasn't really recovered from that breakdown in 2007, 2008.
Totally.
And I think there's still a
Well,
lot of that
another-
that plays into. So somebody like Bernie talking about those things has tremendous appeal.
And it's interesting because this is kind of more a comment on our economy in general than really public policy. But we've, as a society, we've stressed college education for such a long time, and that message has gotten through. We're seeing 60 to 70% of kids graduating from high school going on to get some sort of post-secondary education, right? The problem, which is great. But the problem with that is that the job market is not reflective of a second, of 70% college education, right? The job market, maybe requires 40 or 50% to be college educated, and the rest of them could be, some sort of other, training post-secondary program, not a bachelor's
Yeah,
degree.
we became very active in the workforce development bill last year because of tech ed. I'm a real proponent of tech ed.
Yeah, and
It's cheaper, and you can graduate and get jobs that are
Really good
serious pay, 60, 70,000 a year.
And I think one of the areas in Vermont, I know I have people who I work with in the legislature really want to look at is how do we retool some of that with adult ed now,
Right,
so we
exactly.
can have meaningful retraining rather than just sort of retraining in name, but not really for jobs that exist.
Yeah.
There's a lot of work still to be done on that front.
Well, and that's a really good point, the retraining piece in particular, because there's so many people, and I know a lot of them that have graduated with a bachelor's degree or even a master's degree and go into the field that they studied and don't like it. They realize after the fact, this is not what I want to
That
do.
mom and dad are psyched about
Right,
that.
but they felt like they had to choose something, so they picked something that they thought might be interesting, and then find themselves going back
Yeah,
to school
right,
5 years
right,
later
exactly.
because they want to do something different.
And the other piece of that too is I think we have to recognize how much our job market has changed and is going to be changing going forward. Between automation, artificial intelligence, those sort of things. The job market 20 years from now is not going to look anything at all like it does
And you
today.
better think about it now.
Right.
Right. And be nimble and flexible
Yeah,
to
right.
meet that challenge.
So I read, I know Wikipedia is hardly a source of truth and justice, but they had a definition of the Democratic Party, and they said the party advocates progressivism and American liberalism. Is that true? Because I'm not sure I know what progressive, well, I know what progressivism is, but American liberalism, what is that?
Sure. I mean, I'm not really hung up on labels. I think
Yeah.
they can get in the way of having intelligent discussions sometimes.
Good.
But I think that's sort of where the party has always been under different names. You go back to FDR and the New Deal. You look at John F. Kennedy and the New Frontier, Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society.
right.
It's always been the same basic principles. They change over time because the issues change, but it's how do you help people survive and get ahead in a world that doesn't always treat you fairly? How do you create opportunity? How do you create safety? So whether it was FDR creating Social Security, or it was LBJ talking about Medicare and
That's right,
Medicaid,
right.
whether it was the advancement of civil rights, I think there is a continuity there. And I think whether you call it liberalism or progressivism or democratic values or whatever, I think there are this very definable set of issues that are the core principles of the Democratic Party. And then there's stuff that happens. Society changes, and so the issues you have to talk about change. And what you're doing in 2019 isn't the same as what we were doing in 1942 or 19...
Well, that's because when I read that, I said, because I was an active Democrat under JFK. So cute.
Oh, what were
I was the mailing chairman for Morris County, Morristown, and that whole area in New Jersey, so...
I mean, you want to talk
Very
about
cute guy.
Somebody who attracted young people to
right.
politics.
That's
I
right.
mean,
I was
that
in it.
youthful energy and enthusiasm, the new ideas,
Yeah.
the scientific breakthroughs. That was part of,
Well,
we were talking
we
about
were
why
all-
young people
all
were
my
attracted
friends
to
were
Democrats.
there. We were all there.
Well, and vision too, because to be as forward thinking as Kennedy was, to be able to see, why is it so important to put a man on the moon? Why is it so important
Exactly.
to do? And it's the symbolism of it, right?
Exactly.
It's America achieving great things. I think one of the things that's really striking to me, again, kind of going back to the economy and politics and how, we've kind of ended up where we are today. The New Deal was kind of the promise to America. We were prior to, the war. America was in a very similar position to where we are today. A lot of the wealth was in the top, the top, tier
right.
of the economy, right? These very few people making most of the wealth or controlling most of the wealth. It took a war to change that, right? And the New Deal was the mechanism to try to sustain that.
Yeah.
And 80 years later, here we find ourselves in a similar situation, but no clear rallying call like a war, a global
Thankfully.
war. Thankfully,
Yeah, knock on wood,
to
do something.
rally people around. So what is it that we as a society can rally around to try to pass that promise on to the next generation? Like, what is that piece?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Thank
there's
God they
very,
think of it.
different candidates running for office have different definitions of it. I think some fundamental definitions of fairness and of opportunity. I think those are the kind of messages that, in the hands of the right messenger, can inspire people, can restore confidence in government, can bring hope to people. I think we saw a lot of that with President Obama's 2008 campaign, and hope and change is a very vague theme,
Right.
but people were attracted to that.
Right.
People
Because
felt-
everybody's got their own definition of
Right.
what hope and change means.
Exactly. And unfortunately, from my point of view as a Democrat, he lost the ability to do a lot as the congressional elections changed the composition of Congress, and so it was a lot of holding pattern.
Right.
But I think we need leaders like that in both parties who can articulate a vision that people can buy into, they can feel like it relates to their lives. And I think a lot of what we see in politics right now is this unfortunate tendency that it just becomes a battle for the day's headlines. It's who can shout loudest
Right.
on CNN or
Right.
Fox or MSNBC.
Right, exactly.
And voters get turned off by that. That's not inspiring.
Right.
And we do need to make room for more inspiration, if you want, for more ideas, for honest discussion. I mean, we look at the debates that have been going on at the presidential level, and I've been really struck by the difference of what happens in the, quote, debates versus what happens in the forums. In the
wow.
debates,
That's
everyone's trying to get their 30-second
Right.
soundbite in. They're talking over each other. They're trying to be the videotape that's going to run on the cable news for the next 24 or 48
They're trying to
hours.
get their
little soundbite.
soundbite.
Their
that they
soundbite.
get.
That's our-
But on some of these forums where they have a chance to sit down and give a more lengthy discussion of some complex issues, they manage to do that in a way that makes them more approachable and understandable. And I think we need to think about how we structure some of our political dialogue so that we can get
'Cause
more of
there's
that.
no way in a 2-minute answer that you can explain who you are. Nobody gets to know these people. I was telling an example, when I ran for the Senate, I went up to a thing, there was, I don't know, 17 people. And you had a minute to explain, and of course, I opposed to whatever they were talking about, and the other 16 said yes. So I stayed afterwards, but you couldn't explain in a minute. I mean, they don't know who anybody is. I don't know those Democratic candidates other than, what you see in the sound bites. And that's why our theme is listen behind the sound
I was
bites.
going to say, that's the whole point of the
Well,
show, is to
exactly.
get beyond the 1-minute soundbite.
I don't know how you get to know them, because I'm sure there's some good people
There,
there,
absolutely.
but when you hear the sound bites, you're sort of turned off a little bit. So.
So one of the things when you took over as chair of the Democratic Party, you promised to be more visible and aggressive in challenging Republican views while clearly laying out the Democratic position. So what Republican views are you particularly opposed to, and how do you counter them? And I guess as part two to that question is, what's the strategy for laying out the Democratic values?
Sure. I mean, so I was elected party chair in November of 2017, a year after Donald Trump got elected. And I think for a lot of us, our profound discomfort with many of his policy directions, but even more than that, with the way he's been dividing people, some of his attacks, whether it's on Muslim Americans, whether it's telling transgender people they can't be in the military even though they're qualified, whether it's some of the stuff that quite frankly becomes racist or really offensive, I think is so horrible to our national dialogue.
Yeah.
And part of what we want to do is stand up against that. So when we see children being put in cages at the border, there's room for lots of legitimate debate about what our immigration policy should be, how we enforce it. There shouldn't be room for putting children in cages. And I think we have to talk about those values, talk about the way that those kind of activities are counter to mainstream American values and really challenge them. And I think for us, one of the biggest disappointments has been that even here in Vermont, although much more nationally, Donald Trump has come to define the Republican Party,
Right.
and I think that's to the detriment of Republicans. I also think it's to the detriment of the country, because we need people of principle to be standing up against some of these more offensive things, to not be talking. Let's debate health care, but let's not take
let's do
away
something.
health care coverage
Right.
from 20 million people with no plan to replace it.
Right.
Let's not go to court to try to get rid of pre-existing condition protections unless there's a plan to put something else in place that will cover those people. And so I think when we talk about trying to oppose sort of that level of whether you call it extremism, whether you call it a really inappropriate form of divisiveness, we need to stand up against that. So the values we do try to stand up for then are the ones that help people get health care. They're the values that try to help people make a living, have equal opportunity,
Right.
you know, those sort of things. So I think that's the dividing line between the parties these days. You know, it used to be much more fluid than that. I think
Right.
anybody, you know, I knew James Jeffords pretty well.
Yeah,
You know,
right.
I was a big old Democrat, but I worked with Jim on lots of things. He was very, very useful to work with. By the same token, you know, I knew Democrats like Henry Jackson and other people like that who were much more on the conservative side. We've seen, you know, this splintering where the middle doesn't exist as much in either party anymore. And as a result, the contrasts have become greater.
Right.
And so we try to draw those contrasts where we think they're important and point them out and talk about what the democratic values are.
So it's interesting. You're right. I think the parties have splintered a lot, and they've also drawn to the fringes, right? I don't think that Americans in general have divided as much as the parties have. I think there are definitely issues that do divide people, right? And I think they're often issue specific. So you know, they may float to one side on one issue and float to a different side on another issue. I think the middle in political America still exists, and I think one of and it definitely exists in Vermont. You can see that with the fluidity in elections, right, where you get Bernie Sanders and Phil Scott winning on the same ballot, winning by overwhelming majorities, right? That middle still exists. The folks that will float back and forth between the parties. I guess one of my ponderings in looking at the current state of politics today, in Vermont as well as the country, is how do parties, you know, reach the middle today? How do we get to the middle without?
It's gone.
I don't think it is.
Oh, I do. When I watched the legislature, when I was there was always a middle. And our big thing was there's your bill, my bill, and the third bill. And the third bill is always better than yours or mine, just because it's balanced and it's not quite as radical either side. And I don't see it here. And because people are so angry, it's my way or the highway, and they don't want to do. If they came back, I'd be the first one to cheer, because there's very few people willing to do that, which is a shame, because sometimes if you're in the legislature, you and I will work on a bill and be, you know, strong advocates, and then the next day we're fighting on the floor of the House because but that always was okay. Yeah. And you go to dinner and go to lunch. That's not what's happening now.
But I'd also
I hope
suggest,
I'm wrong.
I think you're right to some degree on that, but I also think that what's happening is about something that's not entirely ideology. The fact that somebody like Bernie Sanders can get, you know, 70% of the vote in conservative towns in the Northeast Kingdom tells me that that's not because of a specific stance he takes on, you know, Medicare for all or any other issue. It's because he talks about the issues that matter in people's lives. He talks about it in a manner that's authentic. I mean, I have, you know, neighbors with NRA stickers and Bernie stickers on their car,
Right.
you know, and that cuts through
Right.
the conventional expectations. And I think
Interesting.
in a polarized political environment, it's interesting to see who are the politicians that do cut through that, who manages, and I don't know if it's about the middle or if it's about connection.
Right.
You know,
I think you're right. I think it is, and to some degree, is about connection. You know, because the candidates that come off as the most authentic are often the ones
And
that
caring,
do the best.
if they really care somehow.
It's like, you know, you look at, you know, even this presidential race, right? Nationally, you know, if you look at the policy positions, Biden should not be doing as well as he is, right? You look at the gaffes that he's made, you look at the policy positions that he has,
People feel
versus
comfortable with
where
him.
the Democratic voters say they are on all these issues. He should not be doing as well as he is. It's the reason he's doing as well as he is because he's got a level of authenticity that
Right.
that
We
resonates
know
with
him.
people. And the same is true with Bernie. He's got a following, and he resonates authentically with people.
Yeah.
And that was really.
And it's either the young people or the senior people, because my own mother just adored Bernie.
Yeah.
And we went up to him at the Tunbridge World Fair. I said, Bernie, I'd like you to meet my mother. sorry, wasn't that rude. I said congressman. And I thought, you meet my mother. She's a real fan. He goes, well, 1 out of 3 isn't bad. I thought, what a great guy. He's got a great sense of humor. He's a funny man. And I thought, I just laughed. I thought that was wonderful. Good for him.
You know, one of the things I tell our candidates when they're running for legislature or anything else and going door to door is, this isn't about you. This isn't about where you stand on issues. This is about the lives of the people you're talking to.
Right.
And you got to learn to listen first, find out what's important to them, and then be honest with them about how you approach that.
Yep.
Yeah.
And people don't have to agree 100% with you on that kind of stuff in order to support you. If they're convinced that you're going to listen to them, if they're convinced that you're going to carry their concerns, that you're going to try to find honest solutions. And I think that's sort of more than, you know, is it left, right, middle, is where politics really lives. And we're fortunate in Vermont to some degree because of our relatively small size, because, you know, a single member legislative district has, you know, 4,000 people.
Yeah, exactly.
But people expect that connection with their elected representatives.
I have found that if I didn't agree with somebody, if I could explain it and it made sense and they understood it, they were more forgiving. They'd say, oh, I understand where you're coming from. Yeah. And as long as you can sit and talk to people and say, or, you know, say, well, I hear you, and here's what I think. And it could be different, but they're okay with that.
Yeah. And that doesn't mean our elected officials and any party should not be doing advocacy for the issues they care about. If they think a $15 minimum wage is the most important thing, and I think it's a pretty important issue, they should be up there advocating for it, and they should be talking about it and find out if the voters in their district support it.
So that's a good segue into the next question we had, which is, we definitely, the Democratic Party definitely had a supermajority in the Vermont legislature this past year. However you define supermajority.
More votes than the Republicans.
Well, more like, but what is interesting is the note that the legislature ended on was the House and the Senate not being able to agree over whether you know, paid family leave or minimum wage was the most important issue to tackle, right? And we talked about it at the beginning of the show, how the Democratic Party, the Vermont Democratic Party in specific, is a big tent, and a lot of different priorities, a lot of, you know, folks that are underneath that tent. And how do you handle that as the chair of a party, that you have to kind of be all things to all people?
I mean, we're very clear in our platform what we support, and we do support both of those issues. But we also don't try to impose that on all of our elected officials. We don't have some kind of...
It's pretty extensive.
Right.
Yeah, you have that platform is excellent.
Thank you. We worked really hard. We got a lot of input into it, and we tried to frame the issues that were really facing Vermont. So, one, we don't have a supermajority. We have 95 members in a 150-member House. It requires the support of either 7 progressives or a number of independents who vote with our Democrats sometimes. So the party itself doesn't have that, and that makes it a little complicated. But the other thing is there is diversity of opinion within the caucus, and not all Democrats are going to march in lockstep on every bill. I would say that, one, it was a very successful legislative session for many issues. A lot of stuff got passed that hasn't gotten the kind of attention it deserved.
It's a good point, because I looked at the list of bills that passed at the end of the legislative session, and there's a lot of stuff that passed that didn't necessarily get headlines.
Right, and some of it's, you know, really groundbreaking stuff, extending the statute of limitations on when somebody who was sexually abused as a minor could pursue it.
Right.
That's huge. It hardly got any headlines at all. Certainly there were the things around, you know, some of the civil rights stuff that happened with, you know, changing class curriculum. So we're teaching more about the diversity of Vermont. I think that's really important. So there were a lot of things that happened, good stuff on climate change, more electric vehicle recharging stations, you know, and you can make this list, and they all sound kind of minor, but when you put them together, it was a successful session. That said, these 2 big issues were there, and I think a lot of us were disappointed, and said so at the time, that they didn't get through during the first half of the biennium.
I think the carbon tax will be there.
Marijuana.
Marijuana legalization. I think I do try to remind people it is a 2-year legislative session, not one, and that it is hard to take a diverse set of people and come up with a solution that that both houses are going to adopt quickly and immediately. And it's even harder to do it when you know that both of those bills are likely to be vetoed by a governor who
Right,
opposes
right.
them, and you need to basically get 100 votes in
right.
the House.
Well,
Right.
somebody told me, I ran into a legislator in Maine.
Speaking
tell
of
you
running
after-
into
I'll
people.
tell you after the show, it's the
Yeah.
funniest thing. I saw the car, which turned out to be Representative Emmons.
Oh,
And
yeah,
I
yeah.
looked up her license plate number because that's the seat number. So I looked up the seat number. I said, "Oh, for Christ's sake, it's Alice." So I sent her a text. I said, "You can walk to where I am, Alice." And so we were talking. But she said a lot of the new legislators put in like 100 bills. They had the most bills this year than like forever, and that's a waste of time.
Right. Well, it's important to remember there were 40 new members.
Right.
The largest freshman
One.
class
Right,
in a
ever.
long
Right.
time.
Right.
I mean, I think since the 251 redistricting thing
Oh,
back in the
right. Oh,
60s. Right. So we had this huge freshman class, and it takes some time to learn how to work in the
Yes, and
legislature.
you're supposed to be, I was told when as a freshman, that you're supposed to be seen and not so much heard, which for me was a very long year.
There's a reason for that, apparently.
Maybe they just told you that.
They didn't get that message.
No, and I think a lot of them resist that message. I
Yeah.
think that's part of what
Well,
a lot
you're
of
there.
younger
Vote's a
people
vote.
sort of feel
Right.
that I've earned my spot here. I
Right.
have a right to have my voice
Yeah.
heard. So I'm convinced that both of those bills are coming back,
Yeah.
and something strong will pass.
Yeah.
That the both houses are committed to working together. We'll see what they're able to bring together, but we're going to see that legislation
Can I just,
pass.
on the climate change thing, I think a lot of us, because Vermont is so small, what we could do everything, anything, and we would make not one iota of change in the bigger picture. And I think that's what some of us are like, what are we doing?
Right.
I want my straw.
I have some metal straws in my, in my car. I'm happy to share
succumbed,
with
I
you.
got corn straws. But and I
Those are
understand
cool.
that because when you look at the water, the ocean, and you see all the animals, I mean the fish and stuff getting caught up. But if it's really costly and maybe it's a good thing to set an example, but it doesn't do much in the bigger scheme of things, and that's why I think a lot of us are like, what are we doing?
Well, I think
Sorry,
Vermont
but-
does have a history of leading
Yes, right.
on some of
That's
these
true.
issues, and there's frequently symbolic value in passing things and serving as a messenger for the rest of the
I agree
country
with
about
that.
things that can be
Right.
done. And you got to start somewhere.
That's true.
You know, I mean, there's a lot of disagreement in the Democratic caucus about carbon pricing and whether it makes sense and how it should be done. As somebody who lives in a very rural area, I can tell you there's a lot of rural Democrats
Right,
who don't want a carbon tax. There are other schemes out there, though, that look at, how do you regulate the consumption of carbon on a regional basis, maybe
Yeah.
with the other New England states. We did it very successfully in the past with acid rain.
Oh, right.
So there are avenues that make sense to go down, and there is no unanimity in the party on those things, but we're hoping for more action. And the bottom line is, whether it solves climate change or not, we're better off when we got solar power in the state.
Well, that's true. Right.
We're better off when people have the choice of having charging stations so you can drive an electric car that's powered by hydro from Quebec rather than by coal from West Virginia.
Right.
There are important things that,
And it does
that are
take
good for
it
us.
does take a couple of years for the new way, like the solar, to work its kinks out and to become, because when you jump in first, it's usually very complicated and costly. And now I notice with the panels, things are
The
getting.
costs have come down
Yeah, the costs have
Right,
come
and that's
down,
all
and
new
it's-
technology.
and it's
You think
no big
about
deal.
computers, you think about cell phones,
Right.
what happens over time. They grow in sophistication and go down in
Right,
cost.
right.
And I think green new energy is going to be an economic driver for the country and for the world, and we should be part of it. And there's some very great
And the same
innovators
with
here in
electric
Vermont.
cars. I mean, they have come. I took one
long
home
way.
years ago when I was at Motor Vehicles, and the house I charged it into the house in the regular house wire.
Oh, my.
I walked in and went phew, and I blew the whole thing out.
But now we're talking
But now they're
about
fabulous.
four-wheel drive
Yeah.
pickup trucks.
Right.
I mean, that can be electric hybrids.
Yeah.
Well, if you live in rural Vermont and someone's trying to convince you to buy a Prius,
Right.
Not my road in the winter.
Yeah.
I live 3 miles
But
up the
the
side of a
truck maybe,
mountain.
yes.
But
Yeah.
you get me a pickup
right.
that's four-wheel drive,
can
I can
move.
think about it.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
You know, and I think it's about giving people some of those choices, and we're all better off.
Well,
when
the
that
charging
happens.
technology is getting better.
Yeah.
You know, you can
don't
charge
have to sit there for
faster
3 hours
now.
anymore.
Yeah, right, exactly.
You can
Exactly.
like it actually some of the like Tesla 3 now. I think the there are superchargers. You can charge 80% in 30 minutes, something like that. So that's like
Wow.
you can plug it in, go get a cup of
Yeah,
coffee,
right,
come
as if
back,
you're
and
done.
you know,
Yeah, well, that,
yeah.
because you're right, it was like hours, right? You had to sit there, that wouldn't
Yeah.
work.
So they're working on that.
Here's something, I'm so glad you're here, because as a party, as the chair, do you testify, or do you use that organization, you were talking about restructuring your organization, do you look to the organization or to your members?
We don't tend to go up and testify on bills. The only exception I'd say to that are ones that directly affect the party. So, for example, this year there was a big elections reforms bill that governed how parties operated, how we did all that. So we, of course, weighed in on that. What we tend to do otherwise is, one, we try to keep our members informed of what's going on in Montpelier. So we'll send out alerts that say, this bill's coming up next week. If you're concerned about it, contact your legislator. Keep people in the party in the know. And then we also talk to our legislative leaders and members. I try to be in the State House cafeteria 1 to 2 days a week, just to touch base with people. We don't do the arm twisting. We don't go in and go, you got to pass that. It's in the platform. We're in trouble if you don't, kind of thing. But we're there to talk to them about the issues. I had, for example, during some of the gun votes, I had legislators trying to figure out, how do I handle this? I'm in favor of this, but not that. Politically, it's tough in my district. And our goal there wasn't to force them to vote a certain way. It was to talk to them about how do they represent their district, how do they represent their beliefs and their values, and to talk about the electoral ways that might play out and how we can support them going forward.
And I don't think people understand how important it is when you're in committee, because you have so much influence, whoever you are, at the committee table. Because the chair wants to get out a bill that everybody can support, because they don't like to get out a, 5, 7, whatever, what's that, 11 divided by? 6 is 5.
6, 5,
Because they want to be able to report that it was a bipartisan, everybody agreed bill. So you really have a lot of power in the committee.
Well, and the speaker wants to make sure that whatever bill gets to the floor can pass.
Yeah, well, exactly.
Because you don't really want bills going down on the floor if you can
makes
avoid
you look
it.
bad.
Yeah.
So I was curious, because you were talking about reorganization, and you're going through a reorg in the Democratic Party, and what's happening?
Every state party does that. It's in state law.
Oh, yes, of course.
That
That's
every
what you're
2
talking about.
years, and it's during odd-numbered years.
Yeah.
In September of every odd-numbered year, the parties hold what are the opening stage in building their structure for the next 2 years. We hold town caucuses around the state. You're required, if you want to be a major party, to hold caucus, to have town committees in at least 30 towns. We're going to have about 180 or 190 when it's all said and done, and we're working to make sure that we, get smaller towns organized. And the idea is you have a committee on the ground there that represents the party, that can speak to the party about what local concerns are, that helps work on elections, that helps local elected officials be stronger. They do a lot of different things, like nominate justice of the peace candidates. They are part of our party platform process that we do every 2 years. So it's a really important step. It's open to any voter. So if somebody thinks they're a Republican and they want to go to a Republican caucus, they can do that, and go to Progressive Caucus. We obviously want people to come to the Democratic Caucus. We then go through the next month in October. Counties meet. These towns select delegates to their county committees. They meet, they elect their county officers, and elect people to go to the state committee. And then every 2 years in November, the parties elect state chair, vice chair, all of our officers, and reconstitute ourselves for the next 2 years. It's a really ground-up approach to democracy, and it keeps us accountable to our voters. It keeps the party vibrant by trying to bring new people in instead of having the same old people just stay in his chair forever all the time. It's a really exciting process, and we brought in somebody this year, an intern who worked just tirelessly working the phones, talking to people, trying to
Right.
get people to organize a caucus in a town that hadn't been organized before, or talking to people about turning out to theirs, because we think it's a real opening for us to connect with our
Well,
voters.
and I think you push, and it's true, what people at the grassroots level can accomplish.
Exactly.
I mean, it's incredible. I saw so just one guy down south came to the legislature all by himself and completely changed a motor vehicle bill that had been on the books for years, and he explained why it was. And that's what happens in Vermont.
Oh.
People can make a difference, and that grassroots effort is the way it
Absolutely.
starts.
Yep.
Right?
And our leaders are so much more accessible than they are in most other places.
Yeah.
We're
That's
really
true.
lucky with
Yeah,
that.
that's great.
Yeah, it's definitely, Vermont's a unique place.
That it is.
Yeah,
You can't
yeah.
lose that for sure, I
No.
don't think.
So there's a number of things that are in your party platform, and we really don't have time to list them all here. But things like affordable housing, education, water quality, healthcare, growing the economy, fairness, equity, and equality, which is not the same thing.
No.
Community, safety and justice, stewardship, democracy. There's a whole lot of things
Goes on and
there.
on, that's great.
You know, how do you as a party accomplish these things?
Well, I think we accomplish them by electing Democrats, and I think we accomplish them by trying to reach out and be part of the public dialogue around these issues. So keeping our activists informed about what's going on with them, helping communicate the ideas behind them, the specific issues that are coming up, and then working in conjunction with our elected officials to enact them.
Because there are some things here that have got to be bipartisan.
Absolutely.
Water quality.
Oh, my.
And the workforce development bill. I mean, there are just some things that we shouldn't have this. I would say healthcare too, but that's a contentious
that's
sort
hard.
of-
It's hard to keep nonpartisan.
I looked at it
but-
and went, no, that's not it. But I mean, affordable. There's so many things that are
yeah.
just.
Yeah.
It's got nothing
You know, my
to do with
Republican
party.
neighbors have the same cell phone problems that I have.
Oh, yes,
you know, I mean,
exactly.
it's not,
Exactly.
these are not
Right.
issues
Yeah.
that are unique to
Yeah,
one
that
party or
last
the other.
mile thing is
Yeah.
like, oh my God, we still have
How
that
many
in
more
Berlin.
governors are going to promise us
I
that
know,
before
exactly.
it finally happens?
Yeah.
Well, it's so expensive. That's why the
Right.
the providers won't go up the hill.
Exactly.
Because it costs them a fortune if there's only one person at the top of the hill.
Yeah.
So you download, is that what they do with the, what is it called? When they use their phone or something, and it takes forever to download because they don't
you
have.
Oh,
Download
download
Da-
speeds,
downloads,
and
yeah.
upload speeds are worse.
We have
Yeah.
people that go to the library in my town to actually work.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You know,
But 5G is coming.
it is.
5G
Yes.
Not every.
We'll never see it.
So
I'd settle for average broadband at this point.
Yeah.
how involved are you, obviously the NEA, but with education? And you were talking about kids graduating with $100,000 worth of. I just Eric advertised, talked on one of the shows that he finally paid off his student loans. I mean, he was all excited one day. Another co-host that we have on the show, and he was all excited. And he let her know, I just paid off my. I mean, he's what, in his
Mid-30s maybe?
mid-30s, and
Yeah.
he's still paying off student. That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
So how do you fix this?
That's not unusual, by the way.
Yeah,
No, I know it's not,
no,
and-
that's a little early.
and-
for
Yeah,
us.
yeah, a lot of people, it is a little early.
But you want a home, you want maybe get married, have kids,
exactly.
and you've got this thing hanging over your head.
Yeah.
I mean, to a certain degree, you know, we don't get involved in the minutia of those kind of issues as a party. We try to set out the principles, and then we try to support our elected officials in advancing those. So, you know, on a national level, you hear many of the presidential candidates running for the
Right.
Democratic nomination talking about debt-free college, talking about
Right.
free tuition, floating different ideas around
I'm
that.
sorry. And then I'm sitting here going, who's going to pay for it?
I know. But
That's
I
in my
mean,
head.
I tell you,
But
no,
I'm
I
the
went
one
to-
who says it's terrible. So
I went to McGill University
Oh,
back in the
nice.
70s.
yeah.
I paid $19 a credit.
Oh my God.
It was a bargain.
Yeah, for sure.
California used to
And
have.
McGill is a great
It was a
school.
great school, and it was really affordable.
Yeah.
You know, California used to have free public colleges for any student who could get in.
Really.
You know, and produce some of the best scientists, some of the best minds have come out of the UCal system. And so I think we have to. It is important to ask how we pay for them. It's also important to think about what kind of investment it is to
Yes.
do it.
I agree.
What's the
with you.
value proposition?
Right.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
what does it add? What does it bring to our economic development? You know, I mean, I think it's really telling, for example, that right now in Silicon Valley, an awful lot of the innovation is happening with scientists, tech people who immigrated to the United States because their education system
Right.
was preparing them for it.
Right.
And our education system hasn't done quite as good a job
Right.
of preparing Americans for it. Now, I'm very pro-immigration, and I think it's exciting to get talent like that from
we
around
agree.
the world
Right.
working on these things. But I think we also have to ask, where are we falling down if we can't, produce some
Agree with
homegrown
you.
stuff there too?
So
It's
do you
great
work-
that we're a
Do you work
magnet.
closely with the NEA and their issues, or are you sort of?
We certainly are allied with the
Right.
NEA on many issues. I mean, I think we generally believe that public education is
Right.
the most important part of our education system. We certainly believe teachers and other staff in our education system deserve to be treated and paid
I know
fairly.
some folks are against the school choice. I was just thinking about that in our discussions, that's not a popular thing, I don't think, among,
Well, nationally, for sure.
nationally.
Yeah, I mean, I think it gets complex in Vermont where we do have this tradition in towns. So I live in a very small town
Yeah.
that has school choice, or up until recently has
Yeah.
had school choice for high schools because we don't have a high school in our
Right.
town.
Oh, well,
Some
you
of our
have to
kids
go
go to
somewhere.
Canada.
Yeah.
There-
I'm
there's-
just trying to remember where you are, yes.
I'm in Montgomery.
It's
I can see
actually-
Canada
you
from
can-
my
yeah,
house.
exactly.
But there's there is that tradition in Vermont. I think what people do worry about are public funds being siphoned off to support truly private schools
Right, no.
and to support religious schools. And I think that's where people get upset. I think in our system where somebody might go to the St. Johnsbury Academy or something like that, I think Burton, places like that, there's a little more flexibility built into that, but I don't want us to chip away at the strength of our public school system because it's essential for our economy, it's essential for our communities. We really need to protect it.
Yeah, and you get schools like St. Johnsbury Academy and Burton who are these legacy schools that have been in the system for hundreds of years and operate as the de facto
Right.
you
They
know,
are
high school.
practically
Yeah, they are,
the,
right.
the public school.
the public school in
area.
their community. And I think what you see in a lot of cases, at least with a lot of those legacy schools, and there's others too beyond those two, but what they're really doing is subsidizing the public school kids with the tuition they're bringing in from the private school kids, right? Because they're paying $16,000. They're getting paid $15,000 or $16,000 for the public school, and they're charging like $30 or $40 for the private school kids, giving the same education. It's really the private school is subsidizing the public school.
I think one of the interesting trends that's happened, and it's not extremely widespread yet, but there are public schools now that are struggling with their student population behind it.
Yeah.
They're recruiting international students.
We've
to
talked
and
about
pay
that.
tuition.
We've been
So we
talking
have
about-
Chinese
Yeah.
students coming and getting an education in some small Vermont town
Yeah.
and helping to keep the local school alive.
Right.
Yeah.
That's pretty innovative. I
That's
like it.
something that we floated a couple of years ago with
Campaign for Vermont.
Vermont, and it's a fabulous idea, I think, because it really turns the paradigm on its head. We've got all this excess capacity in our
Right.
public school systems, and we've got excellent quality in Vermont for the
Absolutely.
most part. Why not use that excess capacity and leverage it to,
Be an attraction.
Yeah, so I think those kind of innovative solutions, I think teachers are open to that, I think administrators are open to that. I don't think it's a partisan issue by and large.
No, it shouldn't be.
And I think we can look for solutions like that.
yeah.
Yeah, we're actually having a meeting next week about this very issue
Excellent.
with a couple of experts we're dragging in here.
That's great.
Because there's got to be something done. There's a lot of empty seats out there, and it's, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, you gotta
And,
sit
one of the questions about all those empty seats is obviously we want to bring young people back to Vermont. We want to bring young
Right.
professionals back to Vermont. If we start closing down schools in some of these communities, are they going to want to move to them?
No.
And so how do we figure out how to keep that capacity there so if we do grow again in the future, if our generational structure changes a little bit so we have a younger population again,
right.
we
How
haven't thrown
great.
that away.
Well, and that is an interesting point because we've seen that type of cycle in the past in Vermont,
exactly.
right? Like for example, in the '60s, in the '50s, '40s, and '50s, we had a lot of similar issues to what we're having now. Populations moved towards the
Well, it's
cities,
cyclical. It's all cyclical, right?
Yeah.
Population moved towards the cities, and then in the '60s and '70s, there's like the back to the land movement. A lot of people went back to these rural towns, and these schools were right around the same time that a lot of these schools were built, right? That we're
And now
seeing
they want us to go back to
and
the-
now the population's going back to the
Right,
cities.
right.
At some point, that paradigm will probably flip
Exactly.
again.
We have 4 minutes left.
Well,
It goes
let's
fast.
get through some
I
stuff.
just want to ask one question, and then we'll turn it. We can kind of talk about whatever you'd like to write out the show, to wind it out. I want to talk about pension, because there's 4.5 billion in
Absolutely.
liability in the state and school pensions, and you talked about having a public pension system, mostly for businesses, but it could be potentially workers.
Sure.
Have you? Where do you stand with that? Are you
So I
pushing
think
it, or?
Yeah, I think there's a couple aspects to that. I'm try to cover them really quickly. The first one is, for far too long, politicians of both parties in this state borrowed money basically from the pension system and from
Right.
the obligations we had there, so they could balance their budgets, so that they could spend what they wanted to spend. And as a result, we have this deep hole in our pension system.
Right.
We need to keep our promises to our retirees, to our government employees and teachers who bargained for this stuff. They may not have had as big of a wage increase because they thought they were going to get retirement.
right.
So we have to make good on that promise. I will say Treasurer Beth Pierce and the legislature, both parties, have been trying really hard in the past few years to start paying that down. And I think that's really positive. It's got to continue. It's got to accelerate. So that's one part of it, dealing with the existing obligations. The other part is there's so many people in Vermont who don't have access to a pension
Lot of
plan right now.
nonprofits.
Right? They don't have retirement plans, and we know that some employees will take the initiative to do an individual IRA
Right,
or
right.
KEO or a Roth or that sort of thing, but many won't. So the state can and should run, and Beth is working really hard on this, Treasurer Pierce is working really hard, to create a system where the state can set that up, make it easy for small businesses to enroll, so they don't have to go out into the marketplace and
And the more in the pool, the
Yep.
cheaper it is
Yep.
for individuals.
Exactly.
And this would be something set up similar to like unemployment insurance,
Exactly.
that
Right,
type
right.
of thing, where it's like an opt-in system
Exactly
that
right.
you can just get it taken right out of your
Yeah.
paycheck.
Yeah,
And
and it just, we know when people are given those options, it works so much better
Right.
than expecting them to go out on their own.
I
Most
feel
people
bad
don't
for-
have the financial
Right.
sophistication to do
I feel
that.
bad for nonprofits because most of the time they're underpaid.
Yep.
Daycare center workers who are, God bless them,
talk
bless
about
them,
an issue,
speaking of
yeah.
underpaid. And so they don't have an opportunity to save because they're trying to, paycheck to paycheck. And what do they do? So this, I heard Beth was running into some roadblocks. It's a
Yeah,
little
she
complicated.
thinks without trying to go into
Yeah,
depth,
no, I
there's
don't
some
know.
regulatory issues that initially made it
Right.
impossible for what she was proposing to happen. They made a change in the legislation this year,
Good.
so she is going to be able to move forward
Great.
with it. We expect that probably sometime in early 2020, the
Great.
program's going to get rolled
Good for
out,
her.
and I think it's really
Yeah.
important.
Because I think there's so many people, like you said, in the nonprofit world, and well, a lot of places, a lot of small
Yeah.
companies. But I'm just worried about the 4.5 billion because even though they're working on it, I think they need something magical, something
Yeah,
out of the
I don't
sky,
have a
some
bag of
kind of
magic
some
tricks.
kind of
Yeah.
creative something
Well,
because it's going to be
It's
a
like paying
long
down your
time.
credit cards when you run them up too far.
Right.
You
Exactly.
gotta just
You just sit
you
down
gotta
and do
find
it.
a way to include it
Yep.
in your budget and do it.
And speaking of unfunded liabilities, the other one that I like to remind everyone of is the lake.
Oh my gosh!
You know,
yes.
we talk about the teacher's pension, we talk about the state employee's pension as unfunded liabilities. We've underfunded the lake for
Yep.
decades.
Yep.
And that is going to be a bill,
And
that is going to be a check we have to write.
Yeah, and it's taken the EPA to force us to start spending
Right.
some of the
And
money.
you
But
wanna
we
talk-
need a sustainable funding source for it, not stagger through each legislative session trying to come up
Yeah.
with, oh, we have some spare money here, we have this. We
I
need to
agree.
recognize
Because
it's
that's
an
an
ongoing
economic
commitment.
I
impact.
agree, at the moment, I'll take whatever we can
Oh, yeah,
get.
absolutely. We should be spending it, but we
Yes.
need to think long-term about it. And that's one
I
of the
don't think
problems.
people realize if they're not on the lake, what the impact is of Lake Champlain on the state.
Yeah.
And all the waterways. I mean,
Right.
that's our bread and butter
it's,
sometimes.
it's
from-
not just Lake Champlain. I live up in
Yeah.
Franklin County. Lake
Right.
Carmi, as
Right.
you all
Oh,
know,
yeah,
has
Lake
been
Carmi.
experiencing tremendous problems. So we need to value our clean water and
I agree.
commit to funding
Terry,
it.
we have
Absolutely.
talked an hour, so.
We have.
Yes, it goes fast. We really appreciate
I
it.
really
thank you.
appreciate it too.
Thank
It's
you.
been a great
so
conversation.
much.
Really
chatting with
enjoyed
you.
it.
Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week, and in the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites. That was great. Thank you very much.
Enjoyed that.
Did we get